For those who love collecting secondhand items, especially antiques, I want you to listen to this story. Some of the items you are currently collecting might bring about a curse that you would never expect. This is a chilling story that happened to Anne, where the entire incident was so terrible that if she hadn't decided to remove that particular collectible from her house, she might have lost her beloved son. Before we dive into our scary story, we would like to ask everyone to like and subscribe to support us in continuing to bring you more terrifying tales in the future. Anne and her husband began their love for collecting antiques without knowing exactly when it started. Before they realized it, their home was filled with numerous antique items, decorating both the interior and exterior. Whenever friends or acquaintances had the chance to visit their home, they would all unanimously say, "Is this a house or a museum?" Their home was well organized, with each collectible item placed meticulously. The members of her household included her husband, her mother-in-law, and their 2 children, a daughter and a son, with the daughter being the eldest. One day, Anne and her husband decided to take their family on a holiday trip to a nearby province. While they were slowing down and looking for a gas station to stop for a bathroom break, Anne's eyes caught an antique shop situated right before the gas station, adjacent to the main road. She suggested to her husband that they could stop by the gas station first and then come back to look around the shop. Her husband agreed immediately, and her husband left the children eating snacks with their grandmother at the coffee shop within the gas station and went to the antique shop. The shop resembled a small warehouse with large antique items displayed outside. As they walked inside, their eyes lit up because the shop was filled with various antiques, from small items to large ones. A woman came out to welcome them and asked, "Are you looking for anything specific? Feel free to ask." Before Anne and her husband could browse other items, they were captivated by a grandfather clock wrapped securely in bubble wrap. Anne's husband inquired, "Has this grandfather clock been sold yet?" They learned that the clock had just been sold to the shop the day before. Upon hearing this, they asked to unwrap the bubble wrap to inspect the condition of the clock. Once unwrapped, Anne was amazed and delighted because it was the largest clock she had ever seen. The cabinet was so big that 2 6- to 7-year-old children could comfortably hide inside it. The cabinet was rectangular, resembling a wardrobe, standing about 2 meters tall. The clock's door had a circular glass pane with a diameter of about 30 centimeters, through which the pendulum could be seen. This was unusual because such clocks typically had a design that made the pendulum easily visible. The entire cabinet was made of Kevin wood, intricately carved and beautifully varnished. Unfortunately, the clock no longer worked. It was broken. Despite this, Anne didn't hesitate to ask for the price of the grandfather clock. The woman selling it hesitated but mentioned that it was under $10,000, including delivery, and her husband agreed to purchase it immediately, typical of novice antique collectors. After arranging the delivery and payment, Anne and her family continued their trip. During the journey, Anne and her husband excitedly discussed where to place the clock in their home. They finally decided to place it against the wall by the staircase, so in the future, if they managed to repair it, they could check the time conveniently when coming down from the 2nd floor. When the day came for the grandfather clock to be delivered, Anne and her husband asked the delivery men to help them place the clock in the planned spot. Once it was set up, it looked just as beautiful as they had imagined. However, what they hadn't anticipated was that the horror story would begin from the very first day that clock entered their home. On the first night, around 11 p.m., Anne and her husband were already asleep when suddenly, she heard the clock chime, playing its hourly melody. What struck her as odd was that the clock was broken, so why was it chiming? The chime seemed to go on for a long time, so long that it woke her husband. He said he would go downstairs to check, but after a few minutes, the chime stopped. Her husband came back to bed without saying anything, and didn't think much of it at the time, assuming he was just sleepy and didn't want to talk because he had to get up early for work the next morning. The next morning, while having breakfast, her husband mentioned that he wasn't sure if he had been seeing things the night before and then fell silent. When asked, he simply said it was probably nothing and then proceeded to get ready to take the kids to school and head to work. And worked as a freelancer and typically worked from home. Her mother-in-law helped her with the housework. After and opened the front gate to let her husband back the car out, she returned inside and her mother-in-law asked her, "Did Kevin forget something? I saw him running up the stairs." Kevin was an 6-year-old son, and her daughter Kim, who was 2 years older, was 8. When heard her mother-in-law's question, she was puzzled and replied, "Both kids left with my husband. You must have been mistaken." But her mother-in-law insisted she had seen Kevin standing and looking at her before running up the stairs. She even heard the sound of a child running up the stairs. She and went upstairs to check, but they found no one. Her mother-in-law looked confused, but they each went on with their daily routines. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, and had some work to finish based on a client's feedback, so she stayed in the downstairs living room. To her right was the front door, and to her left was the grandfather clock by the staircase with the kitchen door beyond that. It was around 10 p.m., and the atmosphere was like a scene from a horror movie. Rain, thunder, though the house was soundproof enough to muffle most of the noise. However, flashes of lightning kept piercing through the curtains, distracting her, so she got up to close them. While she was working, and felt as though someone was watching her from the staircase. When she turned to look, she was startled to see her son standing there, staring at her without blinking. She sighed, got up, and walked over to him, saying, "What are you doing standing here? Sweetheart, why aren't you in bed?" As she slowly walked toward her son, he continued to stare at her, his eyes looking different from the ones she knew. When she finally reached him and touched his shoulder, it was as if he snapped out of a trance, like he had been sleepwalking. That night, she decided to stop working and took her son back to bed immediately. The next morning, which was a Saturday, her husband had gone out for his usual early morning cycling session. And her mother-in-law, who woke up later, began their usual household chores, allowing the kids to sleep in. After preparing breakfast, and called her children to come down to eat. After a while, Kim, her daughter, came down and asked her, "Is Kevin still asleep? Why didn't you wake him up to have breakfast with us?" Kim replied, "I saw him awake, but he was just lying on the bed. I did tell him to come down." Remembering her son's strange behavior the previous night, and decided to go upstairs to check on him and found his room empty. Kevin was nowhere to be seen. She searched the entire second floor but couldn't find him, and came downstairs, slightly panicked, and asked Kim, "Don't lie to me. You said Kevin was on his bed, but I didn't see him anywhere." Kim insisted that she had seen her brother on the bed before coming downstairs for breakfast. The situation quickly became chaotic, and eventually decided to call her husband, informing him that their son was missing. Her husband answered and told her that Kevin was with him. When he returned home, he asked and to talk outside. He began, "Have you noticed anything strange?" and nodded. Her husband then recounted his morning. When he went downstairs, he first saw the clock as usual. However, he also heard the soft sobbing of a child. Approaching the clock, he found Kevin sitting on top of it, hugging his knees and crying. It seemed impossible for a 6-year-old to climb up there. He called out to Kevin, but he remained unresponsive, continuing to cry as if he didn't hear him. Her husband quickly grabbed a 2-step plastic ladder to retrieve him. As soon as he touched Kevin, he seemed to come back to his senses, looking at his father in confusion, like a child who had just woken up. Deciding not to go cycling, he took Kevin for a walk instead. Her husband also shared what happened on the first night. When he went downstairs to investigate the clock's chimes, he saw, in the dim light from upstairs, the figure of a young boy around Kevin's age opening the clock's door and stepping inside, closing the door behind him. Despite the continuous chiming, when he opened the clock's door, he found it empty. He initially thought he was seeing things, but the chiming stopped abruptly as soon as he opened the door, and then shared her own strange experiences with her husband. Both realized they were uncomfortable with the clock and discussed what to do about it. They decided to sell it to an antique store the next day. Her husband arranged for a moving service, although they had to wait until the following day because all the slots were booked. That night, and her husband had their children sleep in their bedroom with them. They didn't know when they fell asleep, but they woke up to the sound of her husband's alarm clock. The unexpected happened in the early morning. When Anne opened her eyes, she realized that her son was no longer on the bed. She immediately woke her husband, who then woke their daughter and his mother to help search for Kevin. They spent a long time searching but couldn't find him. Her husband decided to open the grandfather clock's door, and to their shock, they found their son curled up inside, unconscious, and tried to wake him, but he wouldn't respond. Thankfully, he was still breathing, albeit weakly. After carrying Kevin out of the clock, and noticed a wooden panel covering a section of the clock's base. She suspected it could be opened, but there was no time to investigate as they rushed to the hospital. The doctor said Kevin likely passed out from shock and being in a confined space with limited air. He needed to stay in the hospital overnight for observation. Once Kevin regained consciousness, and her husband had to leave him with her mother-in-law to return home and wait for the movers who would take the grandfather clock away. They also wanted to investigate the panel under the clock. Back home, they went straight to the clock and opened the wooden panel, revealing a small compartment with a well-tied white cloth bundle inside. Unwrapping it, they were horrified to find bones. They quickly rewrapped the bones and took the clock to the antique store, then brought the bundle to the temple. At the temple, they explained everything to the monk, who accepted the bundle and promised to perform the necessary religious rites. He also advised them to return for a blessing once their son recovered. After this ordeal, and believed that the real cause of the strange events was not the clock itself but the bones inside it. She wasn't sure what the spirit wanted, but she was certain that removing the bundle from their home was the right decision to protect her son from further harm.